much for being here this morning, for singing with us. And I want to welcome you into this space this morning where we say out loud that we are willing and want to give ourselves to love. And that means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But in this space, one of the things that means is that you can be yourself here. And for all of the things that make you who you are, we want you to be able to be you. And sometimes that takes a second. It takes a second to allow yourself that kind of space. And it takes a second to kind of come out of the week and all the things that have been going on and just be present with what that actually means. So this morning we want to give ourselves to love, and we want that to be kind of this pervasive thing this morning. If you're new, we kind of want to start with that and want to invite you in to kind of find out more about Watershed. And there's a few ways that you can do that. You can go to our website, watershedcharlotte.com. You can find us on social media, and you can download our app. And any of those ways are great ways to kind of find out what's happening throughout the week. And we'll hear a little bit more later in the service about what we do have going on right now. But before we continue, I want to give you a few minutes to greet the people around you, and then we'll continue singing together.
Tear down the walls I built, every wall I built, every wall I built up. 'Cause you deserve every piece of my heart, every piece of my heart, every piece of my heart. Lord, I am trusting that you are a faithful Father, and all that you have, it is good. You're a generous giver, your love's like no other. Won't you come and break through to me over and over and over again? I am bringing my heart to you with open hands. Closer and closer, you're drawing me in as the depths of my heart lay before you again. Lord, I'm trusting that you are a faithful Father, and all that you have, it is good. You're a generous giver, your love's like no other. Won't you come and break through to me over and over and over again? I am 'cause you deserve every piece of my heart, every piece of my heart, every piece of my heart. Come, tear down the walls I've built, every wall I built, every wall I built up. 'Cause you deserve every piece of my heart, every piece of my heart, every piece of my heart.
God, this morning we are walking in, and we all have certain walls that are up for us. Walls that keep us from being here, from being present, keep us from our emotions. Some of these walls are easy to take down. We can take them down with a few breaths, and some of them are or feel impossible. And this morning, God, we sit with all of that, and I pray this morning that the power would be in our collective presence, our communal presence. God, that even when our eyes are closed and we're sitting down, we're looking forward, God, that we would feel the weight of your presence and the weight of the presence of the people around us, and we would know that we are deeply loved, that we are deeply held in love. Thank you, God. Thank you for this love and for each other. We pray all this in your name. Amen. You can be seated.
Good morning. It is really nice to have you here today. I know for some of you, this experience this morning might just be a release valve. It might be the thing that you need. The guy that walked in the first service and I got a chance to meet, and he's the guy, kind of the guy that walks in a few minutes late and walks out a couple minutes early. He said, I just needed a space right now because my life is kind of crazy this past week. Relationship loss, some crazy stuff at work. And so for each of us, we're here for different reasons. And so my hope is that for some of you, this is a sense of like, this is just a way to kind of kickstart a really good week ahead of you. And for others, maybe it's a salve on your heart and where you sit. So it is really good to have you with us. My name is Scott. I'm one of the pastors here. And we are especially grateful if you are new. It's always meaningful and transformative for our community anytime somebody jumps into this space. And so we offer this experience, this encounter we call Preface here. And if you've ever been a part of Preface, you know how meaningful it is to your on-ramp into what's happening here at Watershed. It's a place where for 6 weeks we sit down. We only do this 5 times a year. For 6 weeks we sit down with a group of folks, and this is the current Preface that's together right now. And we have large gathering conversations, we have small group conversations, and I know for some of you, you say, I don't do well in small, intimate settings. I promise you the hurdle is really low with this group. It's really good folks, and so it's again, if you're relatively new, you're saying, I want to meet other people who are also relatively new in their experience here at Watershed. Then we invite you into Preface. Preface is ending just right now. We're ending our 5th one for the year, and we begin our next one in January. And so if you're interested in jumping into that, go to our Watershed app, click on Preface, and we'd love to have you be a part of that. We also have an experience called Subterranean that's going to be offered on the evening of December 8th. It's a Sunday night at 5:30, and yes, there's a Panthers game before that. Ends around 4:30. Show up here. We can celebrate hopefully a win. And we'll have dinner for you. We'll have childcare. We'll have dinner for your kids. It's a time for us to get together for an hour or so and discuss and dream about what does 2020 look like. It's a place where we have the opportunity to maybe jump a little bit more into the details and the nuances of a more laid-back experience than like we would have on a Sunday morning. And so it doesn't matter if you're relatively new or you've been around a long time. We invite all people into this space, and we especially love it when we have newer folks who can kind of give us a way of how they see the world here at Watershed. And if you've been around a minute, it's also meaningful to hear from you and how you have been connected here. And so that evening is on the 8th. If you're interested in being a part of that evening, if you would, please go to our Watershed app and click on the Subterranean icon and let us know, RSVP, that you're going to be there, just so we can make sure we have enough food for everybody. Last time we had a really full room and just had a great evening. And then lastly, last week I stood up and I invited you we try every year to offer some kind of Christmas expression for us to look outside the walls of what's happening here at Watershed. And so We have a fostering Christmas experience next year, or this year, in the next couple of weeks that we're inviting you into. And so we work with a couple different fostering experiences here in Charlotte. Elon is one of them, and Foster Village of Charlotte is another one. Many of you are familiar with Foster Village of Charlotte. One of our staffers, a former staffer here at Watershed, started that. And so that's a very meaningful organization which we are pretty connected to in a profound way. And then Elon also came to us recently, and they said, hey, listen, I know the fostering space is of consequence to you guys. What if we hosted a party here? Would you allow us to have that as a Christmas party for the families of these who are fostering children and the siblings? We said, well, absolutely. And they said, well, we think your folks would be interested in helping out with some of the gifts. And so we said, we really believe so, because for every year we often do something related to the Christmas space, and you guys respond beautifully. So last week I stood up and I said, would you please jump in? Would you consider being a part of this? Go to the Watershed app, click on Fostering Christmas, and you can see the name of a child, the age of a child, and the specific gift that they're asking for. And we're asking that the gifts are somewhere between $25 and $40. Not too expensive, not too inexpensive, so that everybody has sort of an equalized experience that evening. And so I invited you into that, and last week during the services, it was lighting up. I mean, saw the things going, and I think we only have like another 30 or 40 left to go. So thank you for what you're doing in that. Please don't finish yet. Like, let's bring it in for a landing. What we're looking for is for you to take that gift, a $25 to $40 gift, wrap it up, put the child's name on it, and then put a separate note, like a sticky note, as to what the gift specifically is. Bring that gift to the room over here adjacent to the coffee space and drop it off there, or bring it to our offices during the week, whatever is easier for you. And we would love to be able to make sure every child gets something. So please remember, if you signed up, there is no other backup. You are that child that gives child's gift. So it's very important that you please come through on that. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. And we look forward to what's going to be happening in that experience. Also, I was told that we might have a DJ for that evening because they're requesting one. So we might have an in-house DJ. But if you are a DJ or live in that space, we would love to be able to see if you'd be willing to serve that evening in early December for the party. And if you are interested in being a Santa Claus, apparently they need a Santa Claus. So we would love to have you help us in that space as well. So, and if you want to be a part of that evening, just serving. So you can go to the Fostering Christmas tab. You can click on the serving opportunities. You can sign up for one of those. You can click on the gift opportunities, sign up for one of those. And we'd love to be able to kind of bring our Watershed arms around that whole event. So when we talk about generosity here, when we give to what's happening here, these fostering parties are the kinds of things that we get to do, because who we are is a larger gathering, as a larger movement, is significantly more powerful in our impact than who we are as individuals. We've never been designed to be sort of the lone person. You've been created and you've been wired by God to be in community, in connection with people. And so here at Watershed is part of what we get to do, and part of our connection with each other is to give of our time and to give of our resources. It takes us a little over $13,000 a week to make things happen, and it has been a really, really, really good year and a really tight year. So I want to continue to invite you into that. Maybe you're here and you've been around for a little bit and you're saying, you know what, I need to jump in. I need to own sort of my corner of the table, what's happening here. I'm benefiting in a way, and so I want to make sure I'm kind of giving back. And so we're inviting, our goal is to raise up 7 new families every month that say, or households that say, I'm in for a reoccurring amount, whether it's $25, $100, $500, $1,000, $1,500. We have several of you give at very aggressive levels, and others you give what you can. We invite you into that. You can go to the Watershed app and you can give recurring. And the reoccurring strategy is really, really important because it helps us dream towards the future. It gives us a sense of how to sort of predict what next year might look like if we give in a reoccurring fashion. So thank you for what you give. Thank you for how you give and how generous you are. I look forward to the moments ahead.
All right, we're going to do a little up-down today. So I want to invite you all to stand for this next one. It's going to be a little bit of fun, and hopefully you can feel it enough to move a little bit. Every day I wake and everything is broken. Turning off my phone just to get out of bed. Get home every evening, history's repeating.
Pretty sure that's my new favorite song. That was amazing. Hi, good morning. My name is Liz Rougeau, and my husband Dave and I have been attending Watershed for about 7 years now. We both volunteer in Greenhouse. We've served in the 3-year-old room and now the infant room. I've also been a member of the Her Grow block in the past years. So what's saving me now? First, let me tell you a little bit about my daily life. I wake and leave for work very early in the morning. So early I don't get to see my twin 4-year-old daughters, Natalie and Sarah, and my husband is just waking by the time I'm out the door. A lot of mornings I wake already dreaming of the moment that I get to lay my head back on the pillow. My cup of coffee and a Pop-Tart, along with the Spider-Man soundtrack, help to get me through the drive to the way to work. I get to my school and begin the day that is never complete and usually overwhelming. I work as a school counselor in a Title I elementary school in Charlotte, where the mental health needs are always too many, where my team and the resources available are never enough, and where the traumatic events our children experience keep piling up. There's never enough time in the day. I'm never enough, yet these children and families are depending on me. But what about my own family? Lately, I'm always leaving work later than I want. By the time I get to the girls now, it's already getting dark. The running to-do list never leaves my head. From work to home, it's always there. I'm always looking forward. As I pick the girls up, I'm thinking ahead to dinner. As I'm making dinner, I'm thinking ahead to bath time, and then reading time and bedtime. I'd like to shout out my husband here because lately the to-do list at work has been extremely long and has carried over to home. But he's always there to help me lead that in the evening, and I appreciate that. But by the time we've gotten the girls to bed, I'm exhausted, my husband is exhausted, our dog hasn't been walked, the house absolutely never gets cleaned, and our relationship gets neglected. We crash in our own places to unwind before falling asleep. And then we get to start all over the next day. But every once in a while, on the days where I'm in a place of discontent or feel myself longing for the grass on the other side, I see it, a tiny soap bubble. Of course, I'm washing the dishes at the time, and it's just dancing right around me, and I watch it for a minute, a long minute while I soak it in. It's as if this bubble is teaching me a lesson and giving myself grace and allowing myself to slow down and find joy in the smallest moments. Everything I'm longing for is actually right in front of me. I read a book 10 years ago called 1,000 Gifts, A Dare to Live Fully Right Where You Are. This book was life-changing for me then, before marriage and before children and before I was deep in my career. But it's been even more life-changing now. Anne Voskamp challenges her readers to write down 1,000 gifts in everyday life. And for me, my smallest gift came from the soap bubble. These aren't big gifts like children or husbands or the privilege I was born with, but smaller gifts, like a soap bubble. Giving thanks for these small delights allows me more time to enjoy and give thanks for the bigger things, my family, my career, my friends, my day-to-day. Suddenly, my gratitude list is way longer than my to-do list. I realize that through giving myself grace and weighing down these small moments with my thanks, that I gain the time I need to slow down and realize that the joys that are actually dominating my life. This leaves me wanting to wake up and fully live each day, not wishing for the bed the minute I wake up, but wondering what new opportunities this day will bring. And that's what's saving me now, as I live through the ordinary, everyday life of wake, work, family, sleep, repeat. A slow-moving soap bubble. And now we'd like to give you the space and time to reflect for a few minutes on what's saving you right now. Where might God and the divine be showing up in the cracks and details and routines of your life?
Well, good morning. My name is Matt, and I'm one of the co-pastors here at Watershed. And this morning, I want to begin with this photograph. This is a picture of the Dunhill Hotel here in Charlotte, in Uptown. For those of you who are out of town, this is kind of a historic landmark, and that is, it was built in 1929, and at the time, it was the tallest building in Charlotte. And the reason I wanted to mention it this morning is, according to hauntedrooms.com, it is the #1 most haunted place in Charlotte on a list of 10. And if you go to the Dunhill, the staff will tell you, hey, sometimes it's like there's a presence that you feel in this room, or in room 906, there's actually been like this reported tapping on the nightstand, and sometimes in that room, devices turn off and turn on, and there's all kinds of theories around why it's speculated that this place is haunted. One being that because it was built during the Great Depression, and because it was the tallest building in Charlotte, it has this really unfortunate history of being the site where sometimes people, or a handful of people, decided to end their life. They actually used the height of the building to do that. And so it's got a little bit of a creepy kind of unfortunate past, even though it's a great place to spend the night if you like ghosts, I suppose. But the first week of this series, if you were here, I sort of verbalized a healthy, I would argue, skepticism towards the paranormal. But I'd be lying if I didn't tell you that, like, sometimes it feels creepy in this space, like especially late at night. When you shut down this space late at night, it's kind of old, it's kind of dark, and especially if you're aware of the boiler room that sits right underneath the stage. It's got like this old rusty boiler that looks like it's huge. It looks like you could put someone in it, and it's got like pipes and cobwebs, and it's dark and dank. It looks like any boiler room that you've ever seen in like some slasher film. And so I remember the first. Welcome to Watershed, by the way. I remember the first time that I ever closed up shop here after an event. It was like a preface, and I was standing outside of those doors, and all the lights were off, and I'm trying to arm the system. I'm in complete darkness, and out of greenhouse, like one of those battery-operated toys just randomly goes off. And it's like some kind of horn or screaming, or I don't know what, an animal noise. And I just remember thinking, man, like it's ridiculous that you let your imagination run away with you. And I'm having this thought as I'm literally sprinting out the door because I don't want to be in here. We are in the 5th week of a series called Ghost Stories. And if you're here again the first week, I mentioned how this series was inspired by a book that our staff read several years ago called The Idolatry of God by a guy named Peter Rollins. And Rollins suggests in this book that we are all haunted by something. He says we're all haunted houses, per se. We're all full of ghosts, every one of us. And it's not like the movies where the ghosts are there because they can't let go of the world. The ghosts aren't there because they can't let go of us. They're there because we can't let go of them. And so I know over the past expressions of this series so far, we've talked about like this universal gap that kind of haunts us, that we experience from the time of birth to the time we kind of grow into adulthood. We've talked about rejection and failure and masks and how those tend to haunt us. This morning, though, I'm going to try to go just a little bit of a different direction and talk about a particular emotion that I feel like often haunts us in ways that we're not even aware of. And the way I want to kind of move towards this conversation is to look at 3 instances in the Gospels where Jesus became emotive. And the first one happens actually in John's Gospel. Maybe you're familiar with this story, but it's the story of Jesus and 3 friends of his that are kind of in his inner circle. Mary of Bethany, her sister Martha, and their brother Lazarus. And if you know the story, Jesus is kind of out doing his Jesus thing. He's preaching, he's healing, he's doing miracles. He's doing what he was called to do in that stage of his life. And he gets word that Lazarus has grown sick, is dying, and the sisters are begging for him to come and to somehow solve that problem, to heal Lazarus or whatnot. And the story goes that he doesn't make it there in time. Lazarus, by the time he arrives, has already passed. And it says as he walks into the village, he sees Mary weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping. He was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. And at that point it says Jesus wept. The shortest verse in the Bible. If you've ever done Bible trivia, you know that already. So that's the first account. Jesus weeping over the loss of a friend. Jesus joining in the sadness of his friend's loss. The second story is a story that we find where Jesus is entering into Jerusalem for what would be his last time. And this is on the backside of 2 years of really an extraordinary amount of effort where he's been attempting to demonstrate and announce God's kingdom. He spent a ton of time and energy confronting, attempting to undermine corrupt and abusive forms of power. And he does this first. He directs his energy first towards the nation of Israel, his own, the group of leaders that are in charge to sort of oversee that country or that expression. And then second, he speaks into the power of the empire of Rome. And by the time he gets to Jerusalem, as he enters the city, he realizes that so much of this has fallen on deaf ears. And so much of this it's not been enough. And it's not going to be enough in the present for himself and certainly for future generations of Israel. And it's almost like he senses this impending doom at one level. He knows that Rome will not hesitate to annihilate anyone that gets in their way, which eventually is what takes place in 70 A.D. after his death. In 70 A.D., a general by the name of Titus, empowered by the Emperor Vespasian, goes into Jerusalem, and there'd been an uprising, a revolt from some of the Jewish zealots, and Rome's solution is just to kill everyone, just wipe the whole city dry as much as possible of any sort of ethnicity in terms of Jewish expression. So temples are leveled, and thousands of people die. And so Jesus, he might not know that particularly, but he senses it's that type of future when he approaches Jerusalem, and it says he sees the city and he begins to weep. And he says, "If you, Israel, even you, like you're the group that's supposed to understand this more than anyone, if you, even you, had only known on this day what would bring peace, but now it's hidden from your eyes. It's like you can't see the forest for the trees." And so if you're keeping score, Jesus weeping with his friends, Jesus weeping over the state of affairs for his people in the world. And then finally, this third moment is found in the book of Mark, and it describes this intense personal experience that Jesus has in the realization of his impending future, when he realizes this is all climaxing and it's not going to go well for himself. It says, then they went to a place called Gethsemane, and Jesus said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." He took Peter and James and John along with him, and he began to be deeply distressed and troubled. And he says, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow, with sadness, to the point of death." Have you ever been so sad that you literally thought you were going to die? And so there's Jesus weeping over or with his friends, Jesus weeping over the state of affairs for his people and world, and now Jesus weeping over his own life. And really what we're seeing here, I think, are three images, like three snapshots of Jesus modeling particular types of sadness. And so the first being like this communal sadness. Communal in the sense that Jesus joins in the sadness of those who he is close to in his community, his friends. Losing Lazarus would have been a personal loss, granted. But it's clear that Jesus had some knowledge that he was going to heal Lazarus at some point. And so his tears, his sorrow, really are they're more about how he's identifying with the pain of his friends, the people closest to him in his life, their sadness becoming his sadness, their grief, their mourning becoming his grief, his mourning. And so in this story, we observe Jesus in sort of this communal sadness within the context of his friends. And in the second story, as he's walking into Jerusalem, I think we're seeing him model what I would call a political sadness. Now, when you hear that term, political, when we hear the term politics, it's really easy to get trapped in sort of it only being about a particular party, conservative, liberal, Republican, or Democrat. But really, that's not what I'm attempting to name here when I say political sadness. Political, more from the idea of something being political, almost at an elementary level, that has something to do with how societies or groups choose to create order or harmony for themselves, for their citizens, for their people. And you can't talk about politics, first of all, without talking about people, because politics impact people. But you also can't talk about it without talking about power and structure and systems. And politics, I would argue, are actually a really good thing to the extent as they are helpful and they promote a type of human flourishing for everyone. But now, within the politics of Jesus' day, the way that societies, the way that they would organize themselves, usually only allowed for flourishing to happen for one particular group of people, and usually it was the group in power, and it was at the expense of those who had no or less power. And I know none of that happens today, right? Like that's such an irrelevant idea in our world and day. But if you look closely in terms of the context of Jesus making this statement, there's this political sadness. If you, Israel, this organizing body that's supposed to live in symphony and harmony with God, if only you had known on this day what would bring you peace. Your structures and your systems, Israel. This is eventually going to lead not just your own people to demise, but it's going to cause you to be even more oppressed. It's going to cause you to be even more out of touch with the longing that God has for everyone to flourish. And if only you could see this. And so there's this sadness that we observe in Jesus. It's a political sadness, but it's also important to point out that it's a sadness that's born in the aftermath of all of this effort to step into places so that maybe that wouldn't be the case. And so it's in the aftermath of his sadness. There was also, before his sadness, the grabbing of a whip and clearing out the temple. You know, before there was sadness, there was speaking truth to power again and again. Before there was sadness, there was standing in between an angry mob and a woman caught in adultery. His sadness is in the aftermath of subverting the empire and Israel's leadership through parables and miracles and metaphor. It's in the aftermath of solidarity with the marginalized, the least of these. It's in the aftermath of responding to violence, the go-to tactics for the empires of that day, responding to violence with nonviolence and creativity. It's in the aftermath of enormous self-sacrifice versus self-preservation. Self-sacrifice that's essential in the work of equality and justice and peace, to the point that at some point the sacrifice costs him his life. He's executed by the state. And so Jesus is sad, but it's in a sadness drawn from this deep well of the painful work of justice and liberation within the politics of his day. And this too, and I was thinking about this week. In Luke 19, this interesting story is told about one of Israel's up-and-coming, wealthy young leaders, and this interaction that he has with Jesus, where he asks, Rabbi, what must I do to inherit the kingdom of God? What must I do to inherit eternal life, he asks, which isn't a question about what happens to you after you die. It's a question about what's the best way to organize my interests and my concerns so that those live in symphony with God's interests, God's concerns. And then what does it mean for me to have a life that is like the best life possible right now, today, in the here and the now? And so Jesus responds, so you're not asking about what's another law to obey. Like you're asking a question about essence. And he says, well, then it's really simple. Sell everything that you own and give all of the resources or your possessions to the poor. And then he says everything starts to align. All your wealth will then be in heaven. And he says, then come follow me. Come take up my yoke, so to speak. And that was the last thing the young man expected to hear. And so, and here's that word again, saddened, this man walks away because he was holding on tight to a lot of things and he couldn't bear to let go. It's just really interesting when you read these two stories next to one another and you consider the sadness of a Jesus approaching Jerusalem for the last time, and then you consider the sadness of this rich young ruler. It's like you and I are presented with a choice. And the choice being that when it comes to the political or the politics or the injustices of this world, what sort of sadness will mark our life? Sadness born out of the self-sacrificing work of justice and liberation. Liberation that in the long run is both for the oppressed as well as the oppressor, which is really what Jesus is offering here, right? Like he's suggesting that this man is held hostage to himself, to his power and his privilege in a way that certainly perpetuates the oppression of others. But that's not freedom. To just live choosing to be blind, that's not liberation. And so what sort of sadness will mark our life? Sadness born out of the self-sacrificing work of justice and liberation, or will it be the sadness that has us walking away, doubling down, rationalizing our place in the world because our grip is so tight on the things that we are convinced we have to have, whether that's possessions or privilege or status. A communal sense of sadness, a political sadness, and then there's like the personal sadness of Jesus. And I don't think I need to say a lot about this. I think every single person here at some level identifies with personal sadness, whether it's Jesus's or someone else. But I thought it would be worth just kind of naming that as Jesus sensed the pain and suffering that awaited him in his last hours, he became overwhelmed with a deep form of personal sadness. Personal because it wasn't something he could share. He tried to, but his disciples didn't seem interested. Personal because it wasn't something anyone could take from him. And apparently that includes God. I think most of us, like feverishly in some ways, try to avoid sadness. I think it was about a year ago, maybe this time last year, where a movie came out called Lion. It's starring Dev Patel and Nicole Kidman. And it's the story of this Indian boy that gets separated from his brother at a train station in India. He can't seem to find his way home. He ends up living on the streets, and then ends up living in an orphanage, and then ends up being adopted by a white Australian couple. And so when Donna and I saw the previews of this, we said, that sounds familiar. Our family, daughter born out of, adopted out of India, son born out of Thailand, adopted out of Thailand. And then we have a third son who right around the same age as the boy that you're seeing in this picture came to us from Ethiopia. So we thought, man, like we got to go see this. I bet this story really speaks to our experience. It's going to be inspiring. It's going to be like the best feel-good movie ever. And so, yeah, you see where this is headed. So Umbrella of Grace, we bought a bottle of wine and we snuck it into the theater and we sat at the top of Park Road Theater, and we're like, this is going to be great. And there's like 5 people in the whole place, and we never opened the bottle because from the opening scene to the end, it was like an ugly cry fest, like snot and tears, and I had to leave to go get napkins, and thank God, like I think only adoptive parents were in the theater because everybody was in the same boat. And when we got out of the movie, I just remember thinking, man, like if there's ever a movie that kind of helps you capture what it's like to be in that situation, whether you have a friend who has been adopted or a family that has adopted, like you got to go see this. And so we started kind of telling our friends about this, and we're like, man, you got to go see this. Like I know we've been trying to give language what it's like over the last 16, 17 years, and my friends are like, not in a million years am I going to go see that. Like that is the saddest thing I've ever heard. I can't do that. We avoid sadness. We'll stuff it, we'll deflect it, we'll project it, deny it, ignore it. And I have no scientific data to support what I'm going to say next, which is true about most of things that I say. But I'm convinced that at least in part, every human moment of conflict at some level is a projection of sadness. And because of that, I think it's something that haunts us. I think it's the thing that we're constantly having to deal with, even if we don't realize it's true. But I think in the sadness of Jesus, we're actually invited into something spectacular. We're actually invited into something more grand, more human, more divine, more integrated in the way that we connect to ourselves, each other, and to God. And so, for instance, I think in the communal sadness of Jesus, we're invited to short circuit our false self, our small self. In Galatians, I think Paul kind of tries to give language to this or help his community undergo that process. He uses the language of burdens. He says, bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ, the law that says, love your neighbor as yourself. Love God with all your heart, mind, soul, strength. When you bear somebody else's burden, you're loving them in a way that changes you. Right? Like practically it might change you because often a burden is associated with money, with time, maybe living space, your vehicle, your plans. So there's a literal tactile experience that you sign up for when you say, yeah, I'm going to bear the burden of this particular person or this particular friend. But in terms of bearing sadness, that's a whole other stratosphere because when you bear someone's emotional burden, and sadness certainly being one of those, you're actually opening yourself up to feel and to feel in ways that are really uncomfortable. You're allowing yourself, your emotional self to be interrupted, to be disrupted. And this creates this necessary condition if you ever hope for your heart to be softened or for empathy to expand. And empathy is a miracle at one level. Empathy has this way of overriding our false self, our small self, our selfish self, our self-promoting, our self-serving self, namely our ego. When you experience empathy, you're literally getting outside of yourself, which is what I think makes this story about Jesus so powerful. Jesus gets outside of himself. And so at some level, God gets outside of him, her, itself. And it's one of the most human moments I think that we see Jesus having, and I think it ends up being one of the most hopeful. And it's hopeful because I know there are some of you who are like battling intense emotions and potentially sadness being one of them. And so to wonder, like, does God actually experience what I go through? This story would say yes, God does. He does so to the point of tears, which for some of you here, like, could you just sit with that possibility or reality and let that wash over you? You know, because when you're really hurting, sometimes it feels like God is incredibly distant versus incredibly close. In the communal sadness of Jesus, we're invited to short circuit our false self. And what about the political sadness of Jesus? What could be said in that realm? Well, Jesus tells this rich young ruler, listen, sell your possessions, give them to the poor, give them to the poor. And he's not saying, look, here's another rule to follow, as much as he's inviting him into a particular type of defection. And that sadness, we see him say, look, defect from a life of power and position and privilege. Defect from what you have decided is the sum total of your entire life. And if this rich young ruler had chosen to do so. Defecting would have allowed him to name honestly the role that he plays in perpetuating the suffering of others. He would have had to be honest about how he was a part of the oppressive thing that was happening. But also by subtracting his wealth and giving it to the poor, he would have then become poor. He would have actually defected into a place of solidarity with a group of people that lived farthest to the margins. And it's outrageous for this man to consider, so much so that it was too much. But through the sadness both of Jesus and the sadness of this man, we're forced to ask a really haunting question. How or where are we defecting? Where are we resisting in ourselves and in this world unjust ideas, structures, or systems that undermine the human flourishing of groups who are at the mercy of the powerful? And how do we attempt to move towards solidarity with those who are farthest to the margins? And how do we do this personally and collectively and communally? In the communal sadness of Jesus, we're offered or we're invited to short circuit our false self. In his political sadness, we're invited to defect. And then what's the invitation in the personal sadness of Jesus? Well, this might be hard to hear, especially if you're hurting, but nobody gets a free pass, unfortunately. Nobody gets some sort of exempt status when it comes to sadness. Not you, not me, and apparently not even Jesus. And it's interesting, but I think a secondary theme within these stories sort of that runs underneath sadness could actually be the theme of transition. My experience has been that when you and I are transitioning, when we transition out of an era, the felt instability of watching your previous reality change accompanies with it like this loss of control, even if you orchestrated the transition, right? And a loss of control, it could be said, is both a form of suffering and a form of death. And so it would make sense that sadness could be a core emotion in the midst of great change, and the loss of control. So many people show up here to this community in transition. It's staggering. Even when they pretend they've got it all buttoned up, the more you talk, the more you realize it's usually some season of transition. Maybe it's a religious transition, or a marriage, or a job, or health, or family. And I think Watershed organizationally has what I would call a high transition quotient. I think because of how we attempt to create brave and safe space together. Like, it invites people to be here and go, all right, I can work through something here within the context of this community. So we have like a high transition quotient, but then also I think we have been in transition at one level since we began, but more specifically in the last 2 years. We've had so many new people show up to this community, and so that's a bit of a transition. That's actually a really good transition if you know the truth. Like, if you've shown up in the last 24 months, I don't think you understand how critical your excitement, your enthusiasm, and your passion for what God is doing in your life, and it's somehow being connected to here. You have no idea the energy that's bringing. And so let me just make sure I name that before I go any further. But then also, in the past 2 years, we've transitioned into this space. We've had people who have been here for over a decade have to move to other cities because of jobs. As we've mentioned in the past, or maybe you're aware of, like, conversations have transitioned here to the extent that we talk more about racial disparity and economic disparity and politics and gender and sexuality. And that transition has been hard for folks. And so the way they carry that around has been difficult. But then for some, it's been too much. And so there's been people that we've loved dearly for years that have transitioned out. And man, I got to be honest, real transparent. This hit me out of left field about Wednesday of this week. I started to write on my whiteboard the name of every person in Watershed that in the last 2 years has undergone a significant personal transition, a loss of some sort, the loss of a family member, a key family member, a father, a mother, a sister, a brother, a child, a grandparent, a close friend. And at 14, I stopped writing. 14 people in this space, in the course of 24 months, has had to deal with the deep sadness of transitioning from a reality where somebody key in their life no longer was present. And to put that in perspective, that is exponentially more than all of the personal loss that I know this community has endured in the first 12 years. That's staggering. And not only that, like we live in a culture, we live in a society that is in massive upheaval. All sorts of sadness because of polarization and anger and all that the fear creates. And so here's what I would say. And this might be a little bit ironic. But in the personal sadness of Jesus, I think we're invited into a different type of faith. And I'm not talking about the faith that checks the right boxes. It's true that Jesus endured great sadness. It's also true that Jesus died. But it is also true that his story didn't end with sadness and death. Instead, his story escapes the gravity of enormous sadness and death. And it becomes a story about resurrection. It becomes a story where life and hope and joy, instead of sadness, have the last word. And so faith, I think, looks like a lot of things these days. But in the personal sadness of Jesus, we're invited into a type of faith that says our sadness might be seasonal, it might be situational, but it doesn't have to be God's last word for our life, for this community, and certainly not for this world. It's also the sort of faith that recognizes that our bodies matter. Our physical self matters. There's a reason that the story of Jesus' resurrection has to be told through the physical. Whether you believe that's true or not, that's up to you. But there's a reason that Thomas needed to touch the palms of Jesus' hand to believe. The transmission of life and hope is never rooted in the ethereal. It always has to be rooted in flesh and blood. And so your presence, our physical presence, matters. Mark, Jill, Joe, Tracy, Vanjie, Cindy, Julie, Rick, Alexis, Sylvia. Your joy, your courage, your honesty and hope, your love are contagious. You might be asking, well, who are they? Those are the people on my whiteboard. The people that, in my estimation, somehow, sadness is not the last word. And somehow, the heartbeat of this community is informed by so much life. But I'm starting to recognize that it's the people who have gone through the most that seem to be infusing this community with the most life. There is the courage, there is the hope and the compassion that permeates this space through every single person who shows up here, I would argue. And it does so in a way that reminds us that sadness doesn't have the last word. And I don't care what situation you are or you're in this life, that is not the sum total of what's going on with you. So if you're hurting, you have to start to have faith that there's more to you than just pain. And that when you show up here, like the divine shows up with you. You get that, right? And so as you arrive, as you choose to get out of bed instead of sleep, as you walk into these front doors or you help out or you show up at a block, as you make eye contact, as you're generous, as you're compassionate with your words and your life towards others and towards others beyond even this space, as you laugh and as you sing and as you reflect and as you contribute, you're doing so to the overarching soul of this community, and it matters to every single person who says, this is home. In some ways, it's like your life becomes the antibody that functions here against despair and loss and struggle. That if we're not careful, our world will say is permanent and forever. In the communal sense of Jesus, we are invited to short circuit our false self. In his political sadness, we're invited to defect. And in his personal sadness, we're invited into a different type of faith. A faith that is never meant to be held to ourselves, but to be given away to the world. And so, God, this morning, may we be free. As the oppressed, may we be free. As the oppressor, may we be free. God, may we live in the aftermath of sadness. May we live in ways that move us towards one another. May our joy be contagious. May our hope, may our boldness, our courage be contagious. And God, may we have faith, even when it feels like we don't. May it be so. We love you, and in Christ's name we pray. Amen.
I want to invite you to stand as we close this morning. We're going to participate in this freedom that we've talked about this morning. So I invite you to sing the chorus. It's easy to catch on to, but we're going to sing this phrase over and over again. We'll be free, we'll all be free. There's a world at war, called in suffering, silent casualties. Oh, God, grant us peace. In these sleepless nights, I can hardly breathe. Despite brutality, I know that we'll be free. I know that we'll be free. Let the light in, keep it shining.
Let it break into the darkness. All the love there's us to see. We'll all be free.
In these desperate times, love will hold us
light and keep it shining. Let it break into the darkness. All the love just us to see. We'll all be free. Let the light and keep it shining. Let it break into the darkness. All the love just us to see. We'll all be free. We'll all be free.
Thank you so much for singing with us. And as you go this week, live in that freedom. Thank you so much. We'll see you next Sunday.